Welcome everyone to the Hannah Arendt Center virtual reading group. Today we're discussing what is freedom. This is one of the more, on the one hand, one of the more important essays of Hannah Arendt's. It's fascinating, and yet I will admit it's one of the more confusing to read. It sort of jumps all over the place, and somewhat have to unpack it in a way that can make it a little difficult. But we will do so. What I want to say about it at the beginning is this: the core of this essay is to distinguish two very different understandings of freedom. One is freedom of the will, and one is freedom in the world, freedom as action in politics. And the claim on a broad historical scope is that Greek and Roman and ancient traditions understood that freedom was something in the world, that freedom was an action in politics, and that as a result, they didn't think much about freedom, and they didn't have much of a theory of the will. And it was only with the rise of Christianity, really, with Paul and Augustine, and also to a certain extent with the philosophers Plato and Parmenides, that an alternative idea of freedom as the will, as an interior dialogue, emerged, and that this philosophical Christian religious idea of freedom has over 2,000 some odd years morphed into the dominant idea of freedom today, even in the political philosophers of people like Hobbes and Rousseau, and that this idea of freedom for them means a freedom of the will, and thus a kind of self-control, and thus a kind of sovereignty over oneself. And this has led to the Rousseauian idea of political freedom as self-determination in the sense of sovereignty, which for Arendt is the great error of contemporary politics, to imagine that freedom is sovereignty is to imagine that either sovereignty doesn't exist and thus freedom doesn't exist, because we're never fully in control of ourselves, or that for some people to be free, others have to be, in a sense, enslaved. And sovereignty is a unitary theory of political power, and as a unitary theory of political power, it is one in which plurality is extinguished from politics. And thus, for Arendt, as she writes at the end of section 3 on page 163, if men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty they must renounce. And so this, and she says, this identification of sovereignty and freedom is the most pernicious and dangerous consequence of the philosophical equation of freedom and free will. So to understand that is to understand much of what the essay is arguing against. Have I frozen? Can you guys still hear me? Okay.
I can hear you, but we can't see you.
You can't see me.
No.
Did it just go off? Yeah. Yeah, better. Okay. And so that is what she's arguing against. And what she's arguing for, to just take it to the other side and make sure we have the basics before we have a conversation, is that freedom is action. To be free and to act are the same, as she says on page, I think, maybe 152. But the basic idea in to be free and to act are the same, is that in freedom we act in such a way that people see us, and thus the essence of politics for her is to keep together the political world in which, when we act, we are visible to others, and thus politics is keeping that world in place, that common world in which we, in acting, become visible to others. And in that visibility, we can do things that people take note of. And in having people take note of what we do, we can begin to get them thinking, begin to change the world. And this is really what she understands politics to be. And it is why freedom is such an essential and important idea of politics. In essence, a freedom is what makes possible new beginnings. The very idea of natality, which is a word that is thrown around a lot by people who read Arendt, but it has this idea of beginningness, or to begin. Freedom is what allows something to begin. How does it happen? Well, you act freely. You act and you do something unexpected. People look at you, they talk about you, they take notice. And in some sense, that beginning snowballs and people talk about it and it grows and new acts happen and that leads to new acts. And this is what she calls a miracle at the end of the essay. Miracles are actually not rare, or not. They are rare, but they're not superstitious. They are actually what it means to be free. To be free is to be able to have the possibility of starting something new, and thus to create a miracle. So on page 168, the very end of the essay, she writes, "Every act, seen from the perspective not of the agent, but of the process in whose framework it occurs and whose automatism it interrupts, is a miracle. That is, something which could not be expected. If it is true that action and beginning are essentially the same, it follows that the capacity for performing miracles must likewise be within the range of human faculties." I'm sorry, there's some video issues here. I'm not sure what they are. But the idea here is that freedom, as the ability to act and thus start something new, is politically understood as the human faculty of acting miraculously, to start something new. And while it's unlikely that we actually do create a revolution, it's not impossible, and it's not infinitely improbable. And thus she'll say, and I'll just end here my little introduction at the very end of the book, the last couple lines. The decisive difference between the infinite improbabilities on which the reality of our earthly life rests and the miraculous character inherent in those events which establish historical reality is that in the realm of human affairs, we know the author of the miracles. It is men who perform them, men who, because they have received the twofold gift of freedom and action, can establish a reality of their own. And so, what is freedom? It is the human capacity to act in the world in such a way that we can establish a reality, make a world, and thus bring about a miracle. And that's why freedom is such an essential political idea for Arendt. There's a lot of background that leads up to that, and I talked a bit about some of it in the video. but let me maybe stop there and see if there are some questions, or maybe do it this way and say, that's why I think the essay is important. There's a lot else in the essay. There's the discussion of science at the beginning, and the wonderful and I think for some people maybe puzzling statement that thought makes freedom disappear. Now she doesn't mean by that 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 freedom is unthinking, but she does mean what she does mean is that insofar as we think rationally and try to understand things, and therefore have them make sense, provide causal explanations, freedom will disappear, because freedom is something like a miracle, a new beginning, something unexpected. And so that's how she starts the essay, with this distinction between, on the one hand, our consciousness telling us that we are free and responsible for our experiences, and our everyday experience of causality in the outer world, in which we think that everything is caused and everything has a reason. And this, she says, seems to make the question of freedom somewhat meaningless and impossible to solve. The one person who helps solve it is Kant, right? And the reason is that Kant makes this distinction between theoretical freedom, which he says doesn't exist. Freedom really doesn't exist in the world as something we can know or see or experience. And practical freedom, which can never actually be seen and never really exist. And she makes a fascinating distinction. Kant makes a fascinating distinction between reality and actuality. Freedom doesn't ever really exist. It's not a thing. It's not a thing that can be seen or felt or experienced. But it actually exists insofar as it underlies the potential of human action. And that's the practical nature of freedom. We cannot act insofar as we assume we are free. And so Arendt says that in making this distinction, Kant saves the idea of freedom as something that's actually relevant in the world, even if it's not really in the world. All right, let me stop there for a second and give you guys an attempt to, or a chance to ask questions. Like I said, I know it's a difficult text, so if there's just a portion of the text you're confused by, if you want to ask a more general question, a more specific question, the chat, you can type it in the chat, or you can blurt it out. I'm going to pause just for a second to let you collect some thoughts. Comment on note 14. All right, now I gotta find note 14. Comment on note 14. 14, we find this conflict in Euripides. Can you tell me what page note 14 is, just so I can find it? I don't have the notes memorized. I apologize. Harold, can you tell me what page note 14 is on? Oh, it's going to be on page 157 or something. Yeah, okay. So in note 14 is on page 157, as far as I understand it. We're talking here about with Christians and Christian freedom. And she says, Augustinian solitude of the hot contention within the soul was utterly unknown for the fight in which he had become engaged was not between reason and passion, between understanding and thumos, what that is between two different human faculties, but it was a conflict within the will itself. And note 14 says, we find this conflict frequently in Euripides. Thus Medea, before murdering her children, says, and I know which evils I'm about to commit, but thumos is stronger than my deliberations. And Phaedra speaks in a similar vein. The point of the matter is always that reason, knowledge, insight, etc. are too weak to withstand the onslaught of desire. It may not be accidental that the conflict breaks out in the soul of women who are less under the influence of reasoning than men. Oh, there we go. That's going to be conflict. There we go. So thumos, for those who don't know, is sort of like anger or passion. And so what's going on here is that Arendt is talking about how for Paul and for many of the Christians, there's a contest in them between the will and the will not. Paul discovered a kind of freedom, she says on 156, which is non-political. It's the freedom of the inner dwelling, the engage with myself, the chamber of the heart. And so there was this long tradition of solitude and the solitary man. And she says, in addition to this dualism, which is the existential condition of thought, classical philosophy since Plato had insisted on a dualism between soul and body, where the human faculty of motion had been assigned to the soul, which is supposed to move the body as well. Yet the Augustinian solitude of hot contention within the soul was utterly unknown, for in the fight in which he had become engaged was not between reason and passion, between understanding and thumos, that is, between two different human faculties. It was the conflict within the will itself. So the argument here is that the Greeks well knew solitude, and the Greeks well knew the conflict between passion and understanding. So when Medea, in the Euripides example, says, I know I'm about to commit evil, but I am so angry I have to do it. There's a conflict between my sort of reason knowing I shouldn't do evil, and yet my anger telling me I should do it. And this is a common experience of Greek tragedy. The comment on women, I don't know. I'll leave for now. It's a classic trope, obviously, that women are more passionate and therefore, to some degree, less rational than men. What it means that Arendt here embraces that is interesting. She clearly was quite a rational person, but not sure how to take that in the footnote about whether that's something she's embracing or simply pointing out as a matter of Greek understanding. But in any case, that opposition between reason and understanding, reason and passion, is different from the internal fight, the hot contention that Augustine and Paul are describing, in which it's not reason against passion, it's will against will, right? The argument is, I will to do this, and I also will not. Man can will, and so if you read the next paragraph, we read into it, the paralyzing effect that will seems to have upon itself comes all the more surprisingly, as its very essence obviously is to command and to be obeyed. Hence, it appears to be a monstrosity that man may command himself and not be obeyed. So Paul, the classic example is, well, I will to be a good moral man and not commit adultery or not commit these sexual acts, and yet I also will not to because I want to, right? That's sort of the classic Christian Pauline opposition. It's not reason versus passion. It's will against will. And Arendt is suggesting that this will against will is something that the Greeks didn't think of. The Greeks saw reason and passion, and there's a relation between one will as the more rational will and one more as the passionate will. But the Christians saw it as two wills, and that these two wills are in deep opposition. And the question is, can we, in a sense, will to overcome our will? And that is what we call willpower. The willpower is the will to overcome those wills we don't want to see exercised. And that's, in a sense, what Nietzsche means by will to power. The will to constantly elevate ourselves above into a region of sovereignty, to go back to the opening comments on sovereignty. And so this is the tracing of this ancient distinction, this ancient discourse from the emergence of the will with Paul and Augustine up through till Rousseau and the idea of self-mastery and self-sovereignty in Nietzsche and Rousseau. That's a long answer. I apologize, Harold, to comment on footnote 14. I don't know if that's what you wanted, but I think that is where we can go. You can follow up if you'd like. Kim asks, can I go over page 155? There's a long paragraph beginning every attempt. Okay. Kim, that's not on 155 in my version. So we may be using different versions. I see it's on 153. Also, please, can you clarify will and will to power? Well, okay, I just did a little of that. Let me read the paragraph and see. So the paragraph Kim points us to is on 153 in my edition, or maybe 155. It's long. Every attempt to derive the concept of freedom from experiences in the political realm sounds strange and startling, because all our theories in these matters are dominated by the notion that freedom is an attribute of will. Okay, that's where we started from. And then this current argument does not hold what perhaps is true, that it is in the nature of thought to need more freedom than does any other activity of men. That may be true, right? That thought needs more freedom than any other activity of men. But rather that thinking is itself not dangerous, so that only action needs to be restrained. So this is the liberal idea of freedom, right? That it's okay to let people be free in their thoughts so long as they don't act on them. And this, as she says, is a fundamental tenet of liberalism. You know, it also is the way liberalism treats religion, which is that freedom of religion becomes freedom of belief. You can believe what you want, but it doesn't include the freedom to act on those beliefs in rituals and communal life. And there's a strong argument to be made that liberal freedom of religion is really not freedom of religion, insofar as religion is a communal activity, a bond. And so within liberalism, religion is often turned into simply an opinion that one shares, not a way of life. And that is, at least for many religious thinkers and religious believers, not an adequate understanding of religion, which is one of the reasons why liberalism and religion have such a difficult relation together. But the protection of opinion, but not the protections of actions, is part and parcel of the liberal elevation of life and security to the highest social and political goods. So she says, for politics, according to the same philosophy, must be concerned almost exclusively with the maintenance of life and the safeguarding of interests. And so liberalism allows you to think whatever you want because that's not dangerous to anyone's life, but it doesn't allow you to act on it. And this is for her a real misunderstanding of both freedom and politics. If we understand politics as she wants us to, as she expresses that in the next paragraph, freedom is the raison d'etre of politics. It is the very reason for being of politics. And if this is going to be meaningful, we have to understand that freedom as the reason for being of politics means that politics has to allow us to act politically, not just think freely, but act freely. And thus, we need courage. And she goes into this wonderful discussion of courage here. The courage is not simply the courage to think what you want or believe what you want, but to act. Act in the world, to leave the protective security of our four walls, our homes, and enter the public realm. This is the end of the paragraph here. Not because of particular dangers which may lie in wait for us. The courage is not because we might, have dangers, but because we have arrived in a realm where the concern for life has lost its validity. In politics, dying is actually totally okay. In politics, being killed or being injured is part of what it means. Because what we're concerned with in politics is not about our lives and our interests, but about the world, the political world that we share and making it. And so the last line here is that courage liberates men from their worry about life for the freedom of the world. So think about the difference between life and world. Life is, internal to us, individual. It's to live and be secure. But the world is what we share with everyone. And what courage does is it liberates us to act in ways that might endanger us, but that's not at issue. What's at issue is a remaking and a new beginning and a revolution and a protection for the world. So that courage is indispensable, she writes, because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. That, in many ways, that can be one of the more important sentences in all of Arendt's writing, right? Courage is indispensable because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. If you understand that sentence, you really get to the heart of Arendt, which is that in politics, it's not about protecting individual security. It's not about protecting individual interests. Liberal politics is predominantly about protecting individual security and individual interests. But in politics for Arendt, it's about building and protecting and reimagining a world as a shared, lasting, common entity that we recognize as that which lies between us, that we can share, a world of facts, a world of made things, but also a world of actions and monuments and memories and stories that we share. And so that is very much what is going on in this paragraph, Kim, if that helps. I hope you can follow up. Bob asks, have any other political philosophers picked up Arendt's concept of action as the essence or best expression of freedom? So the answer, I think, is yes. So first of all, to a certain extent, she borrows it or parts of it from Montesquieu. And so it's definitely, I would call, a counter tradition. But there are a number of thinkers today who have been very influenced by Arendt on this. Jacques Rancière is a French thinker who's been very influential in rethinking politics in what he calls as an act of dissensus as opposed to consensus. I don't think Arendt and he agree on that per se, but the act of dissensus is an action, and it is an action in which politics is the sovereignty and the unity of politics is constantly interrupted, and he certainly is in agreement with Arendt on that. There are others as well, Claude Lafleur, um, um, Chantal Mouffe, a bunch of French thinkers have certainly embraced Arendt's idea of freedom as action. Werner Hamacher, I think, a German thinker, and others as well. So it's been influential, but clearly it's still I would say it's still a counter tradition. It's not the main tradition of political philosophy. YW writes, by remarking that freedom creates miracles, does Arendt also imply freedom always brings about positive consequences? Certainly not. After all, we can imagine possibilities that starting new and unexpected things bring catastrophe. Certainly. Yes, no, the claim that freedom, that politics is about miracles is certainly not a uniformly positive and progressive notion of politics. Not at all. But for Arendt, it does mean, first of all, that totalitarianism cannot succeed unless we eradicate human freedom. All right. So a lot of this, again, and so much of Arendt's thought begins in her response to totalitarianism. But totalitarianism is, in the end, an attempt to stamp out spontaneity, to provide a single totalizing fictional coherent fantasy that dominates a reality. And for Arendt, as long as human freedom in some sense exists, as long as there's still people who can act, there's always the chance, and indeed she comes to believe the likelihood, that the lies of totalitarianism will crumble eventually. Not easy, but eventually. And so that is a potentially optimistic reading of her work. That said, she does in a later essay called On Violence, which we've read a while ago in this group, can always read again. She does contemplate the possibility that in a technological age, the people in power employ not human beings to do their work for them, but robots. And in employing robots, might be able to fully stamp out freedom insofar as they would become so powerful and violent, and the things doing that violence would not be subject to thought and conscience, that they could eventually potentially stamp out freedom. So that would be the caveat. But in general, Arendt does, and so yes, it's very possible that acts of freedom will be acts of catastrophe, totalitarianism or authoritarianism, violence, and she doesn't at all think that freedom will always lead to harmony and persuasion and goodness, but she thinks that over time, a humanly built world where freedom exists will tend to preserve freedom rather than eradicate it. Now, preserving freedom doesn't mean preserving peace at all. It doesn't mean preserving uh, equality. So there's no progressive claim that freedom will lead to the kind of society you might want. But there is a claim that freedom will not eradicate itself unless and until we reach a stage in which rulers rule with the aid of robots that can eradicate freedom. Sam writes, Habermas's idea of discursive democracy evolves out of Arendt's idea of the political and action too. Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated one, and there's a lot of different views on Habermas. To the extent, and somewhat this depends on how you read Habermas. To the extent you read Habermas as I do, which is to say that the idea of discursive democracy is a technical idea of democracy designed through something like an ideal speech situation to lead to a kind of legitimate, just, and one would even say right authority. It is very much counter to Arendt's idea of freedom, in which there is a plurality of contesting and contestatory communities and ideas. Now, there are ways to bring them together. So Arendt's idea that politics requires a public space where people can act can be read as the kind of technical free speech situation that Habermas is after. I don't think that's how Habermas intended it. I think his is a much more prescriptive idea of what is and isn't allowed than Arendt would ever imagine. But they're on the same. The problematic is the same. Zephyr writes, I'll try to articulate the question. It seems like Arendt's view would lead to thinking not of those in government per se, but those who limit the possibilities for action as the potential limiters of freedom. That is, freedom includes the economic realm where imagination happens. That is, entrepreneurialism is part of freedom. That's a clumsy way to put it. But that it's not just about expression on future governmental action, but about action in the economic realm and Google, etc. So it seems that Arendt's view would lead to thinking not those in government per se, not of those in government, but those who limit the possibilities for action as the potential limiters of freedom. Yes, so the limiters of freedom, right? Those who limit freedom can be in government, but also can be economic and social as well. I mean, one of the great limiters of freedom, now it's in my head, limiters, it's not a word, but one of the great sources of the limitation of freedom is the social realm for Arendt, right? The realm of conformity, the realm of religion, or the realm of prejudice can limit freedom. And for Arendt, one of the core roles of politics is to constantly challenge prejudice and thus the limitations on the way we think and see the world. She describes that in her essay, The Promise of Politics, or What is Politics, in The Promise of Politics. But also in a way, if action is freedom, I take this to be the second part of your question. Entrepreneurialism is also a kind of freedom. The difference, I mean, without a doubt, entrepreneurialism is a kind of freedom for Arendt. and so is so is any action that we take. I see a lot of ways this question's going, Zephyr. I'm not sure which way you wanted it to go. But so for Arendt, there is, I mean, let me say, she believes strongly in private property, primarily as a protection against the conformity of the public sphere, and thus the need for a private sphere in which you can be protected and have a realm of freedom. And it's from out of that realm of privacy where you can become a unique individual that you can then act in the world. And she's also quite in favor of this idea of courage, of acting, a kind of entrepreneurialism. Acting in order to build businesses is certainly not something she's opposed to, but it's not at the essence of political freedom. That said, and I'm still thinking this through, so I'm just trying to think it through. There's no doubt that, as you say, Amazon and Google have changed our world, right? I mean, without doubt, as has Facebook, to add one in. And insofar as they have, they are political actors. I mean, when Mark Zuckerberg or Eric Schmidt or Jeff Bezos creates one of these things, people react and build and talk about it, and it becomes part of the common world we share. And that freedom to do so is part of the freedom to change the world through miracles. I mean, there's no doubt that all three of those men have created miracles in the Arendtian sense. Something that could not be expected. And who could have expected Facebook 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Maybe it was 20 years. So fast, it's hard to remember. But, these are new things that have rebuilt our worlds. What I would say is this. There's a difference between things that rebuild our worlds that are done by individuals seeking to create businesses, which are totally legitimate, and miracles that change our world that are done through a kind of collective deliberative action. And that's what politics is. I mean, I think one way to think about this is there's no doubt that Facebook and Google and genetic modifications and cloning will change our world. But we as a world, we as a people, don't have much control or say over those changes because they are done haphazardly by individuals and are not subject to the kind of political deliberation that would allow us to say, okay, this is happening. Do we want it to happen? What will the impact of it happening be? And how can we mitigate or, in a sense, direct that impact in a way that we find politically better? And that's the work of politics. And, and that's not the work of experts. That's the work of politics. So I think that's what she would. But Zephyr, I'm happy to answer further if there were a follow up.
No, this is great.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think part of it is when there's this private, but I think you should answer the other questions first, and you helped answer it, but that there's this private realm which serves as this important role, but sometimes things move from this private realm into freedom limiting, non-political but quasi-tyrannical, even though they come from the economic realm. Anyway, but I think it really helped me think some of it through.
You're saying, Zephyr, you're saying that like something that Amazon does limits us, not that we're
Yes.
limiting Amazon.
Right, exactly. That it starts to become a government, and that so even though it's technically in what she might call private, it starts to feel like it's government. So we don't look at government just as that which we call government, but rather government as that which limits um, uh, freedom to act.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Amazon at this point is no longer a private thing. It's social, at the very least.
Right.
And I think what you're saying is right. In some ways, it's even public or political. It becomes the way. I mean, Facebook is the way a lot of people interact in public nowadays. Google is certainly the way a lot of us interact in public. It's the way we find information. It's the way we know, what is written and what's going on in the world. And so what I'm saying is that's when it becomes absolutely imperative politically for us to insist on asking ourselves, what's happening, and how can we, exert an influence on what's happening, and that's that's what she means by to think what we are doing, and to think what we are doing is something that all people, not just technicians or engineers or politicians, need to do. I think one of the hardest that's one of the challenges of her work is that we all need to be constantly looking at Facebook and Amazon and saying, look, this is happening. We got to take it seriously, and not say like, Ray Kurzweil, who I think is a very brilliant man in many ways, says, look, this is fate. This is going to happen. We can't stop it. Let's just celebrate it. And not to say on the other side, like the Luddite view, we have to break Facebook up and break the internet and go back to living in, little communities. I think somehow you have to sort of look at what's happening and say, we need to judge it. We need to ask, is this something we want to be happening? And if not, we need, as a political community, to exert will over it and regulate it. And that's certainly something she fundamentally believes in. She's not, I mean, regulation can be a dirty word for some people, but it's certainly not for her. I mean, I don't think she's interested in she's not interested in the question of, she's a very suspicious of bureaucracy. Let's start there. She doesn't think bureaucracy is the right way to govern, precisely because what bureaucracy does is empower bureaucracies, bureaus, offices, and not people. What she does want to do is say we need, as a people, to make decisions and judgments and then pass laws that will try and carry out those judgments. There's a difference then we can make between laws and regulations. And she's someone who believes that we should be making laws more than we should be making regulations. Increasingly, the way our government works is we make regulations rather than laws, because laws take a lot more work to make. And they're also done in the public, whereas regulations are done in largely hidden inside agencies. And so we forfeit the legislative role increasingly and hand it over to bureaucrats, and that's something she's very worried about. Susan Oberman writes, can you explain what she means by saying that thought makes freedom disappear? Yeah, I'll try. I tried to do it a little bit before, but and let me say, the only way I can explain it is by doing something that I'm very hesitant to do, which is to say that she may have misused the word. Arendt, you have to remember, this essay was originally written, again, like many of these things, for a popular audience. I think it was published in a journal. I forget which journal it was published in, but she makes a distinction in a lot of her writing between thinking and reason, or thinking and rational thought. And rational thought is not thinking for her. It's logical. It follows rules, and it often is related to science and the attempt to pin things down. Whereas thinking is expansive. And if you read these first 3 pages of the essay, you'll see that she's making a distinction between freedom as something that we in our consciousness and conscience have, so in ourselves, versus the scientific view of freedom. So she'll say on the first page of the essay, in my version 142, in all fields of scientific and theoretical endeavor, we proceed according to the no less self-evident truth of nihil ex nihilo, or nihil sine causa, namely, nothing is without a reason. That is, on the assumption that even our own lives are subject to causation in the last analysis. And insofar as you take that scientific approach, freedom is sort of an oxymoron. There's no such thing as freedom, because everything has a cause, and if you can just figure out the cause, you understand why it happened. The fact that I go like this, right, seems to me like my choice. The fact that I'm sitting here instead of, out playing with my kids when they're off school today is a free choice. And yet the scientific view, taken to the extreme, says no, there's a series of causes that led to this, and we can discover them. And even if we as humans can't discover all of them, it used to be then said that God would know them all. And now people would say, well, artificial intelligence and some machine could figure it out. And if we just built a big enough one, everything that happens would be predictable, right? And so the idea is that if you figure out a big enough brain like God, or the biggest machine you could come up with, everything you do would be predictable. This is, of course, the dream of Google, right? Or and Amazon and Facebook, that we can create algorithms that predict your behavior so much that advertisers will pay a lot of money for them, because they'll be able to figure out what video of a cat will make you buy a trip to the Bahamas, right? And that's the goal. So when she says that thought in its theoretical as well its pre-theoretical form makes freedom disappear, what she means is that if you fully think things through and think that they are there's a cause for everything, there is no such thing as freedom. Okay. Mitch writes, ironically, considering the historical relationship between the two figures, Arendt's conception of freedom seems close to that of Isaiah Berlin. That would be ironic, in that there is inevitable discord between groups that need to be managed. Plurality. Okay. Yes, they both are thinkers of plurality and discord. That's for sure. But remember that for Berlin, freedom is freedom from, right? It's the freedom from interference, whereas what he calls freedom to, which is the Kantian idea, freedom in his idea, is always dangerous for him. Whereas for Arendt, I'm trying to find where she says it, but she says that liberation is so this is on page 147 in my book, and she says freedom. She says that we first become aware of freedom or its opposite in our intercourse with others, not in the intercourse with ourselves, right? So freedom is, as I've said many times, to be in public, in an open space with others. Before it became an attribute of thought or a quality of the will. Freedom was understood to be the free man's status. I am a free man, not a slave, which enabled him to move, to get away from home, to go about into the world, meet other people in deed and word. This freedom clearly was preceded by liberation. So here we get to Berlin. In order to be free, man must have liberated himself from the necessities of life. This is what we can call freedom from in a Berlin fashion. But the status of freedom did not follow automatically upon the act of liberation. Freedom needed, in addition to mere liberation, I love that, mere liberation, the company of other men who were in the same state, and it needed a common public space to meet them, a politically organized world, in other words, into which each of the free men could insert himself by word and deed. And so this is a very non-liberal notion. It assumes a kind of liberalism, but it assumes much more than liberalism. Freedom is not simply to be free from interference, but it's to be free from interference so that one can insert oneself through word and deed into a public world. And that, I think, is quite a leap from liberalism, and certainly from Berlin's liberalism. Is that all right, Mitch? So Bob writes, I think that in this conversation, Arendt's concept of action is being stretched too far. When I interviewed her in 1970 or 71, she dismissed the idea that economic matters were part of what was appropriate or essential to politics. Perhaps action is a broader term in the way we're using it to see how she wants to apply it for her purposes. Yeah, I was trying to draw that line. For her, what you call economic matters are not for her essential to politics. That's right. So to the extent, you decide to work extra hours so you can buy a steak instead of potatoes, or you decide to take a new job or work, more hours or whatever it is so that you can go on vacation. For her, that's not politics. Similarly, as long as you have enough money so that you are not living in misery, she thinks you're free. She makes this distinction between poverty and misery. She thinks being poor in no way disqualifies you from being free. Poor people can choose to engage in politics. They're poor, but they're not miserable. Their needs are met. But when you're miserable, which is a distinction that she adds onto the lower end of poverty, when you are not confident that you'll be able to eat, when you're not confident you'll be able to pay your rent, then you don't actually have the opportunity to engage in politics. You don't actually have the opportunity to insert yourself into the world in word and deed, as we were just talking about here on page 147. And then you become invisible. And it's invisibility for her which is the true antithesis of a political life. So when we were talking about Amazon, right, and entrepreneurialism, we weren't really talking about misery or poverty or even about economic matters. That's why, as I understood Zephyr's question, it was a little bit hard for me to answer it, because with something like Facebook or Amazon or Google, we're not actually talking about someone working instead of inserting themselves into the world. We're talking about someone who's created a new part of our world that other people have noticed and embraced in such a way that that thing they've created has changed all of our worlds collectively. At that point, we're not talking about an economic matter. We're talking about something that has deeply changed our collective, common, public world. And that is an action. You know, if I make a loaf of bread and then we eat it, I've made something, but it sort of disappears. If I make uh, a statue and no one cares about it, maybe one day I'll use it as a doorstop and I'll knock it over and it'll break and it'll disappear. But if I make a statue and it becomes something that people talk about and love, and it's placed in the middle of Central Park or on the wall in Washington, D.C., it becomes part of our public world. And that activity of making becomes an action, not just a work of, not just an economic act and not just a work act, but an active act. And in the same way with Google or Facebook, the people who made these things have made something that has now become part of our world. So I don't think we can exclude that from action. Bob, if you want to respond to that, I'm happy. You know, it's an important conversation to have. Either you or Zephyr or others might be
I think you've got it right, Roger. I probably was off on a tangent.
Okay, Bob, I doubt that, but okay. Gary Patton asks, as an elected official for 20 years, and by the way, we should all become elected officials for 20 years, steeped in Arendt's, I made many people mad, then you're doing something right. When I asserted, as I repeatedly did, that regulation is freedom. Yeah, I mean, so this was part of the conversation I was having with Zephyr earlier, Gary. Certainly bureaucracy is not freedom, but the self-conscious decision to reflect on and control our actions is freedom. The problem today, right, as soon as we enter the political world, is that regulation means different things to different people. And it has come to have this negative connotation of a faceless bureaucrat regulating you. And that's something that would be dangerous. But as long as you're okay with that, then I agree with you. And that's exactly what politics needs to do. I mean, that's that part of it, Gary, you're 100% right on. Politics needs to think what we are doing and self-consciously seek to regulate it. But that means not handing it off to bureaucrats, but doing it transparently and in public in a way that there are people responsible for it, so that when others disagree, they can argue and not push against the string. Where does Arendt talk about the need to regulate corporations? Man, does she talk about such a thing? Economics is never political for Arendt, and consumer decisions are certainly not forms of political action in the way she conceptualizes it. I hope that, I think I just said that in regard to Bob's question. I'm now realizing maybe I made a mistake in what I said earlier, because both you guys responded that way. Certainly consumer decisions are not forms of political action, although boycotts are, and that's a kind of consumer decision, right? So economics is never political for Arendt. I don't know what that means to say economics is never political for Arendt. I mean, certainly how much we should tax people is a political decision. Certainly whether we should have monopolies is a political decision. I mean, there are ways in which what she says isn't political is she thinks that there should be enough welfare slash safety net such that people are not in misery, as she expressed at the conference in Toronto near the end of her life. But in general, she thinks that's a technical question, right? How to get that. But she thinks that the effort to create social equality through economic regulation is for her dangerous to politics, because it makes politics increasingly a technical effort to equalize what is not equal, which is the private and social lives of people. But certainly there are political questions that have to do with economics. So I don't know, maybe Sam can rephrase that. I see another question. You say, Sam says Google or Facebook might be a fact of our common world and a fact of reality, but I'm not sure we can think of them as an art form, like a statue in a public park. Well, I would agree with you, Sam. I'm not trying to say they're an art form, but what I am saying is that they are a part of our common world, right? What Arendt talks about as the worldliness and the artifice of the human creation is that which we share. Works of art are one part of that. So are facts. So are books. So are natural treasures like the Grand Canyon. But although that's not man-made, but there are man-made things which become part of our common reference. And they are, and as she says in this essay, to say that politics is like a work of art is not to say that it's a product that is made and that therefore exists and just stands there. But it's more like something that is like a performance to which people respond. So she talks about this in her discussion of virtuosity and politics. So yeah, I think happy to, if you want to respond to that, Sam. It seems like you're resisting some of this. I'm not sure exactly what it is you're resisting, but you're welcome to follow up on it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not wholly resisting. I'm really hesitant to think about specifically these examples of Google and Facebook or Amazon as artifices that have been made and build the world that we share in common, in the sense that Arendt talks about forms of architecture or statues or novels or music and so on, primarily because Google, Amazon, and Facebook are essentially technologically driven shopping malls in certain senses that have been created to generate revenue as corporations. Which goes to my other the other point of disagreement when you're responding to Zephyr, which you mostly corrected, which is that economics for Arendt precedes the political, right? So even when she's talking about a minimum level of social welfare, so that people are not living in abject misery, that's so that they can be free to participate in the political, right? You have to have a certain level of economic security before the political realm, you can enter into the political realm.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the disagreement is, but
well, I mean, it was with your. It was the disagreement was in in response to the way you responded directly to Zephyr. Yeah, and agreeing with her assertion that regulating these internet corporations is a form of political action, or that the way we engage in them could create spaces for public freedom.
Yeah, I'm not, again, I'll beg not understanding, but just to go to the text, and maybe it will help, and maybe it won't. On page 152, she says, since all acting contains an element of virtuosity, and because virtuosity is the excellence we ascribe to the performing arts, politics has often been defined as an art. This, of course, is not a definition, but a metaphor. And the metaphor becomes completely false if one falls into the common error of regarding the state or government as a work of art, or a kind of collective masterpiece. In the sense of the creative arts, which brings forth something tangible and reify human thought to such an extent that the produced thing possesses an existence of its own, politics is the exact opposite of an art, which incidentally does not mean that it is a science. Political institutions, no matter how well or how badly designed, depend for continued existence upon acting men. Their conservation is achieved by the same means that brought them into being. Independent existence marks the work of art as a product of making. Utter dependence upon further action to keep it in existence marks the state as a product of action. So what I was trying to say is that all action contains an element of virtuosity, a kind of excellence, a kind of performativity, and that includes the act of both creating something like Facebook and also the act of participating in it. And once it is there and people participate in it, it becomes part of at least our social world, right? The world in which we interact with others and other groups, and to a certain extent also part of our political world, insofar as it becomes the way in which we have political conversations and read and consume political news. And I don't see how that's controversial, but then the question becomes to what extent we can regulate that kind of action. And by regulate, I'm using it in the way that I think Gary Patton was using it, to mean something along the lines of think about it and think how we collectively want to control it. I mean, there are all sorts of economic entities that become important in the world. I mean, big corporations are one of them, which is one of the reasons we want to regulate them. Property is one, which is why we regulate property. So it doesn't strike me that just because they are done for a profit, they can't be part of the political world that we need to address. I'm not sure if that's what you're saying or not, but
No.
What? Did you want to respond? No. Yes.
I think that was somebody else talking, but that was what I was saying, because if economics is pre-political for Arendt, then how can the regulation of economic entities then be central to our political world? And I haven't settled on this. I think it's interesting to especially think about.
I don't know what you mean by saying economics is pre-political for Arendt. I mean,
well, the political is not economic for Arendt, right? And when she talks about
includes a lot of things. The political, I mean, yes, in order for what is needed before the political emerges for Arendt is a space of appearances.
Right,
That's
which is
that's what's needed. And there are
right.
people who are able to appear, and there are some people who may not be able to appear. And to a certain extent, that can be an economic question. It can also be a racial question. It doesn't have to be economic. It can also be a religious question. There can be, exclusions for appearance based on economics, on race, on other ideologies, etc. So, and all of these things are things that exclude certain groups of people from politics for Arendt, and for her should be overcome so that people can engage in politics. But none of that is to say that, once something done for whatever reason, whether it's done through work or labor or through thinking, for whatever reason, once something that someone does becomes noticed and engaged and important in the world, it becomes action. It becomes an action. It sort of jumps, right? I mean, the work of art is work, not action, and yet it, in a sense, jumps into the political sphere as an act. The same thing can happen when someone creates a company that becomes so powerful that it begins to control large numbers of people in the way they think. So I don't see how, again, one of the great mistakes in Arendt scholarship is people take these distinctions that Arendt makes in some of her writing, like labor, work, and action, and try and turn them into these, all encompassing theories of something. They're useful heuristics. They help us understand different activities that she thinks are important. But in the end, the boundaries between them are incredibly porous and not to be, we don't want to say things like that just because Google is a for-profit company, it can't in any way also create things that act in the world. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it's not. Can I just respond quickly? I mean, I think saying like Jeff Bezos, engages in a form of action and creates something and brings it into the public world, I agree with that. But if I agree, of course, with you about the categorical distinction she's making, but we live, now corporations are legally treated as people that appear in the world and can act, right? And I don't think for Arendt that would be political in the sense that, or from Elon Musk is
on that we'll just have to disagree. I mean, I think unions are deeply political. And what unions are a group of people organizing collectively around common, largely economic interests. And the reason I think unions have a role in politics is that each individual in the union has their own interests, but only the union represents the interests of them collectively as workers. In the same way, corporations are part of our world. And while all the people working for the corporations have their own interests, the corporation looks out for interests of corporate entities. Same with universities, which are corporations, right? I think universities have a role in politics, and they should, as universities, represent the interest of universities in politics. So I have no problem with corporate entities, which are, what would our world look like without universities, unions, and corporations. I mean, it would be a very different world. They are part of our world, and I think they're an important part of our world. And I'm not against those kind of collective institutions representing themselves politically. And I don't know what Arendt thinks. I mean, I don't ever claim to know what she thinks, but I would highly doubt she would be against that either. That's part of the humanly created world that we should address and should act in it. And so I'm always in favor of collective groups expressing themselves. To me, that's a deeply Arendtian idea. Yeah, I mean, if other people want to jump in, I'm happy to hear other views on this. Daphne has written also, but they are creative inventions. I don't know what the they is. I guess Google and Facebook, employing modern technology that have become lasting components of our Western lives. Yeah, I take that to be in a part of what I've been saying, if I understand it correctly. I don't think of Facebook and Google in the world as economic actors. Clearly, yes, the companies have huge economic incentives and want to make lots and lots of money. And we should maybe be suspicious of them for that reason. I'm fundamentally on board with that. But what they've created right now, one of the reasons it needs to be regulated is that it's almost like a public good, like the town square is. I mean, if we were to take out the town square, at one point people would have gone, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" I mean, if we were to just tomorrow get rid of Facebook and Google, I mean, people's lives would be thrown into chaos. At least many people under the age of 30. So, I mean, to me, it's sort of not a controversial statement to say that they're now part of our common world.
What may I?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
What I wanted to say was that I think Arendt would have appreciated the fact that technology, which she wouldn't have imagined existed in the 1960s or even the 1970s, is now being used to create such a momentous, maybe life-changing fact of our modern lives. And so I think it was a creative and therefore artistic, perhaps, contribution. What becomes later is the profit motive, and then we can discuss that.
I don't know if the profit motive came later or earlier. I mean, I think in some cases it's hard to say, and in some cases it was clearly profit motive. But I don't think that matters, because I think what Daphne said is right. It has been momentous. It's been a miracle. I mean, if you want to put it in those terms. Someone earlier asked the question of, well, can't miracles be catastrophic? Yes. And it may well be that these are catastrophic miracles. But there's no doubt that at the last sentence of the book, it is the men who perform them, men who, because they receive the twofold gift of freedom of action, can establish a reality of their own. I mean, Facebook and Google and Amazon have created realities, and the people who established them have helped create realities of their own. I see that as a kind of miracle. I don't see it, I think that there's good that comes of this miracle, and I think there's bad that comes of it. And that's a long and that would be a great conversation to have. But I don't know how to, but I think it is without a doubt an act of freedom that certainly has had enormous impact on our world. Gary asks, as you mentioned the town square, I'm reminded of the legal cases that held that shopping centers as private property are equivalent to the town square, and therefore could not be shut off from the exercise of the First Amendment freedoms that we have. Same kind of thing with the virtual town square provided by Facebook and the other large corporate providers of internet services. Yeah, I think that is a bit what I was thinking of, and I think it's a good analogy, Gary. There are a lot of private corporations that come to be part of the public world. One place, just to speak to Sam if she's still on, one place where Arendt explicitly talks about this is in the Little Rock essay, where she says that private bus companies and private hotels and restaurants, when they're serving a public function, have to be treated as public goods, right? And therefore, they can't simply say, I don't want to serve black people because, I'm a private company. She says, because they're serving, because even though they're private companies, the fact that they're in a public space and they serve people makes them public entities, and they can't just claim to not be public entities. And so I think it's a similar point to what Gary was just saying, and Daphne.
Can it, Roger?
Yeah.
I think I think that's a good point. But when the example about unions, I think that example from the Little Rock essay somehow supports what I'm thinking, and maybe we're talking past one another a little. But with the unions or other collective corporate interests involved in politics, right? Activate in politics, which has led to the privatization of public goods. And those things cannot be disentangled from one another. And so, yes, of course, if a private company is operating in a public space, then they have to treat everyone in a certain way and can't discriminate on the basis of race. That makes absolute sense to me. But not corporate participation in politics as political actors. I don't think that is Arendtian.
Yeah, Arendt certainly believed in corporate participation in public affairs. That's what workers' councilors are. So, I don't even think, I don't know how to, corporations of people are part of the public world and deeply important parts of it. We might not like certain kinds of corporations, and we might like other kinds of corporations better, but that doesn't mean that a corporation is simply just a corporate body. It's a collective body of people acting. And I think that if you lose sight of that, we get lost. But as long as we understand what a corporation is, which is a collective group that's making common decisions, that is very much what it's a kind of. There's no reason to think that such a corporate body can't have an enormous and important impact in our world. So, thus the development, I would just add, of corporate bodies is actually a deeply important and political activity. Which is why the emergence of workers' councils and discussion groups and all sorts of collective groups, town councils, for Arendt are part of politics. Now, a corporation simply aimed at economic ends is one that she doesn't think is so useful. But there are certainly corporations that play a large political role and need to be addressed politically.